close your eyes and clap your heels together 3 times. And think to yourself, there's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. Oh, I'm still here. Welcome to Teacup For One. My name is Matt, and I have 2 degrees, and welcome to another episode of the Teacup For One Wizard of Oz movie marathon. So every week in August, we are going to be watching our way through a different film inspired by the wonderful Wizard of Oz, and coming together on Wednesday nights for a live stream discussion of the film of the week, featuring some of my favorite Disney YouTubers and Instagrammers. And I'm extra excited because the film for this week is one of my personal favorites, none other than Disney's unnecessarily terrifying sort of sequel to The Wizard of Oz, Return to Oz. Okay, now there is a lot to unpack with this film, and I've actually already done an entire video about why I think Return to Oz is just so subtly and psychologically terrifying / tragic / sad, so I highly encourage you to check out that video. But even more so, I encourage you to check out the live stream chat this evening, and if you're not watching this the day that the video releases, watch it on the replay, because I have some incredibly insightful folks who are going to be joining me on the panel to talk about Return to Oz. But for today's video, I want to shine a light on something about Return to Oz that I don't think gets nearly enough attention when people are talking about the film, and that is the return of the ruby slippers.
My ruby slipper!
No. My ruby slippers.
I love the Gnome King. Okay, so this is the only live-action Wizard of Oz film since MGM's 1939 film to feature the ruby slippers. Every other Oz film or TV show has had to use silver slippers. Why? Because like most things pertaining to the Wizard of Oz, you've kind of got 2 versions of the same thing. You have the original version as it was created and established in the books written by L. Frank Baum in the early 1900s, all of which is now in the public domain. But then you also have the versions that were established and created by the 1939 MGM film, which is definitely not in the public domain. In fact, I'm worried they're going to find a reason to sue me just for making this video. So, of course, in L. Frank Baum's original novel, Dorothy's magical slippers are silver, and this was the original plan in the MGM film. But because they were shooting with Technicolor, they wanted this film to be a visual spectacular, and they pulled out all the stops. So that's why we have the vibrant yellow brick road, the electric emerald city, the witch's characteristic green skin. I mean, there's a frickin' horse that changes color every 5 seconds, mostly due to Jell-O and questionable ethics. But regardless, at some point in the production process, they decided that Dorothy's magical slippers would pop so much more against the yellow bricks if they were a vibrant ruby red. In fact, it worked so well that it has solidified Dorothy's ruby slippers as the most important prop in American film history, if not film history, just in general. This has come up during some of our Oz live shows, but all of the copyrights surrounding the original 1939 Oz film are currently held by Warner Brothers, and they keep The Wizard of Oz very tightly guarded. So all of the character designs, costume designs, production designs, pretty much anything visually that you think of when you think of The Wizard of Oz is owned by Warner Brothers, which is kind of a shame because they have this incredible property on their hands, and aside from a mediocre Tom and Jerry direct-to-DVD animated film and a brief cameo in Space Jam 2, they really have not done anything with Oz. And because they own the rights, it means that no other studio can do anything with Oz, or at least the Oz that people know and love. So because Warner Brothers keeps such a tight grasp on The Wizard of Oz, it's kind of created this exclusivity. The ruby slippers cannot exist outside of this one film. And because Warner Brothers hasn't made any effort to give us a reboot or a sequel, the Ruby Slippers haven't had a life on screen aside from the 1939 film, with the exception of Return to Oz. Evidently, Disney paid to use the Ruby Slippers in their Oz film, but that was all they paid for, so they were not clear to draw any further inspiration from the MGM film. However, Disney did option the rights to some of the earlier L. Frank Baum books, and other Oz books by that point had already fallen into the public domain. So that's what gave us this fully realized on-screen version of Baum's Oz with MGM's Ruby Slippers. And since then, the Ruby Slippers haven't appeared on screen. And even though over the past few decades Return to Oz has kind of accumulated a cult following, it's hardly a movie that everyone has seen. So as far as the general public is concerned, the Ruby Slippers only exist in that one MGM film. And the closer we get to that film's 100th anniversary, the more the Ruby Slippers are being ingrained in legend and enshrouded in mystery. Because just think about it, in the original film, we're never told what the Ruby Slippers' powers actually are. Yes, we're told that they're able to transport Dorothy back to Kansas, but the Wicked Witch of the West also says that once she gets the slippers, her powers would be the greatest in all of Oz, but we're never told why. And so this question of what the Ruby Slippers can actually do remains unanswered. And I mean, that's something that would probably have to be addressed in a reboot or a remake, but Warner Brothers isn't in a hurry to do that anytime soon. And so the mystery of the Ruby Slippers endures. And in some ways, I'm okay with that, because the lack of insight into their magical properties really just heightens the mystery of the Ruby Slippers that much more. And the reputation of the Slippers has just been pushed even further into legend and mystery, largely because of the actual costume pieces that Judy Garland wore, or might have worn, during production of MGM's film. You know, these were pieces that probably cost around $15 to make at the time, and are worth between $2 and $3 million today. The Wizard of Oz was shot at a time when there was no regard given to screen-used props or costumes as having any significance once the film had wrapped. And it's because of that mentality that the Ruby Slippers famously ended up being abandoned in an attic in some MGM warehouse, just left to rot. And because there weren't any thorough records being kept during production of The Wizard of Oz, nobody really knows for certain how many pairs of Ruby Slippers were produced for the film. It's generally accepted that there were 7 pairs created, and currently we only know the whereabouts of 5. And I am going to admit right here, right now, that even in 2021, the age of the internet where everything is documented, there still seem to be a ton of discrepancies as to how many pairs of Ruby Slippers actually exist and who owns them. But based on my labor-intensive research, I can't even say labor-intensive Wikipedia research, because I actually did a deep dive into researching this on the internet to bring this information to you. So, based on my labor-intensive research, this is what I could find about the 5 surviving pairs of Ruby Slippers. Pair number 1, the Reynolds pamphlet. The Reynolds Slippers. So if there is one celebrity, aside from Judy Garland, that is associated with the Ruby Slippers, it is Debbie Reynolds. Debbie Reynolds was famous for collecting and preserving Hollywood memorabilia. And she had this beautiful collection that she acquired over the years, and she had this lifelong goal of having these beautiful pieces on display for the public to see and appreciate. We love Debbie Reynolds, and one of the prized possessions in this collection was an authentic pair of Ruby Slippers. But this pair is extra interesting because even though they were worn by Judy Garland, they were never used on screen. When MGM was in pre-production, they were testing out 2 different styles of Ruby Slippers. There's the design they ended up going with, which is the one that we all know and love today, which is pretty well like a standard heel or pump in shoe language. But then the other option that they were considering was a more whimsical, fairy tale-esque shoe. It kind of looked like an elf shoe that had a pointed toe, and it's commonly referred to as the Arabian slipper. Now, according to Debbie Reynolds, that's the slipper that Judy Garland was pulling for because she thought it looked cool, but MGM opted to go for the simpler style because they thought it went with the rest of her outfit better. So, anyway, Debbie Reynolds ended up owning that test pair of ruby slippers that never actually made it into the film. Now, I just found out today that she also had a pair of more conventional ruby slippers that matched the ones that were used in the film. Very recently, her son, Todd Fisher, showed off these slippers on a YouTube channel when he was doing a tour of his mother's collection, and I think he thinks they were used in the film, but I'm almost positive that they were replicas, because back in 1989, the Western Costume Company released a limited edition replication of the ruby slippers to celebrate The Wizard of Oz's 50th anniversary, and they were made to the exact same specification as the slippers that were used on screen. And those slippers alone, like the replicas, are collector's items worth thousands of dollars in their own right. But the big difference between those slippers and the slippers that were produced for the film is, well, I mean, first and foremost, the replicas were made in the 1980s and the originals were made in the 1930s, so there's definitely a difference in quality there. But the sequins that were used in the replica slippers were a lot more vibrant and a lot more red so that they could mimic what was seen on screen, whereas the sequins that were used for the ruby slippers, like the actual props, were more of a burgundy, because that's the color that ended up translating through the Technicolor process to give us the vibrant red that we know and love today. Sorry, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but the main takeaway here is that, according to Todd Fisher, he has a pair of screen-used ruby slippers, but I don't think he has a pair of screen-used ruby slippers. But, I mean, really, who are you going to believe? Her son? Or this guy who did 5 minutes of internet research? Number 2. The People's Slippers. So, these ruby slippers are a size 5. They're notable because they have orange felt at the bottom, which was used to kind of muffle the sound of Judy's walking and dancing along the yellow brick road, because the road was made out of plywood, and then, you know, there was a lot of clicking. So, there's a lot of wear and tear on the felt underneath, which has led people to believe that these shoes were used for dance sequences and a lot of movement sequences. Now, they are currently on display at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and they just got this beautiful restoration done. So I think they're probably in the best condition out of all the ruby slippers. Actually, maybe second best, and we'll get there. But they're significant because for a while there, people thought these were the only pair of ruby slippers. Back in 1970, MGM did this massive auction where they kind of sold off all of the stuff that was their legacy, which was a giant mistake on their part, but whatever. History is history. They did it. And these slippers were bought at auction for, I think, $15,000, and the buyer was convinced and told that they were the only pair. But as soon as news got out that the ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz had been found and auctioned off, someone came forward to say, wait a second, I thought I had the only pair of ruby slippers. Which brings us to pair number 3, Dorothy's slippers. So, in 1970, when MGM had its auction and sold off the pair of slippers that are now at the Smithsonian, a woman named Roberta Bauman came forward and said that she had what she believed were the only pair of screen-used slippers from The Wizard of Oz. In 1939, Roberta Bauman was a member of her high school's Film Appreciation Society, and she entered a contest where she had to predict the top 10 films of 1939. She ended up coming in second place, and her prize was a pair of screen-used ruby slippers from MGM. Now, these slippers were a size 6, and it's kind of accepted now that they were probably used for promotional purposes, and they might have been worn by Judy Garland or her stunt double, or both. Now, throughout her tenure of owning these slippers, Roberta Bauman would bring them around to schools and show them off to kids and families just as a cool thing to do, you know, to share this beautiful piece of movie history with people. Eventually, when she found out that there were other slippers that were created for the film, she decided to sell them off at auction, and those are the slippers that ended up being displayed at Disney's MGM Studios in The Great Movie Ride. Now, in 2000, those slippers were again sold at auction where they went for over $600,000, and I believe they were bought by a private collector, and we don't know who that is, and we don't know where they are now. Moving on. Number 4. The traveling slippers. These ruby slippers are a size 5, and they're owned by collector Michael Shaw. And they're known as the traveling slippers because Michael Shaw famously took them on tour. He brought them on the road. He would exhibit them in shopping malls and just other places where people could come and see this beautiful piece of motion picture history. But their most famous exhibition was at the Judy Garland Museum, where they were stolen in 2005 and missing for 13 years, and they were only recently recovered in 2018. And finally, number 5, the holy grail of ruby slippers, the witch's slippers. This pair is known as the witch's slippers because they're the pair that was used on the Wicked Witch of the East's feet, and also the pair that was used for all of the close-ups of the slippers. So the reveal when Dorothy first gets the slippers, the heel clicking. The main difference with these slippers and all of the other screen-used slippers is that the witch's slippers are still in pristine condition. All of the other slippers had the wear and tear that came from Judy Garland dancing down the yellow brick road. They all had that felt at the bottom to muffle the sound. These slippers, no felt. These slippers in almost perfect condition. They originally belonged to Kent Warner. Kent Warner was a costumer who was hired to go through the inventory in MGM's, prop and costume storage when they decided to auction everything off. He is the one that found all these pairs of ruby slippers. He kept them for himself, but then turned over one pair to MGM for the auction. That's the pair that currently exists in the Smithsonian. He sold one pair to Michael Shaw, another pair to Debbie Reynolds, but kept the best pair for himself. For years, they were his prized possession, but then, as is the way with ruby slippers, he eventually decided to sell them at auction. Now, this pair is extra exciting for me right now, because in doing the research, I discovered that this is the pair of ruby slippers that were recently purchased by the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences. So Leonardo DiCaprio kind of started a celebrity Kickstarter campaign with people like Steven Spielberg to make a massive donation to the Academy so that they could purchase the ruby slippers. And the slippers are currently slated to be put on display in the Academy's brand new museum when it opens in a couple of months. So, if my research is correct, that means that there will be 2 pairs of ruby slippers available for the public to view. The pair at the Smithsonian and the pair at the brand new Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Museum. I mean, I'm not going to get to see them anytime soon, but it makes me really happy just knowing that they're there and that people can see them. Because the ruby slippers are such an important and such an iconic piece of movie history. Especially considering that they're probably never going to make an appearance in a film ever again. And in an age where all movies are just being reduced, reused, and recycled and going back to franchises that people have seen before, I think there's something extra magical and extra special about having the ruby slippers be this thing, this icon, that's frozen in time in this one very special, very magical film. And Return to Oz. Anyway, friends, this concludes yet another episode of Teacup For One. Now, if you want to hear me talk more about Return to Oz, the film itself, make sure you tune in for our live stream discussion right here on the channel. I'm going to be joined by Lauren from Castles, Capes, and Clones, Jen from The Magic in the Music, Megan from The Pumpkin Queens, Morgan from Teaching Disney, and Disney bounder extraordinaire Miriam Kenly, aka Instagram's The Churro Fund. So make sure that you join all of us for this chat. I think we're going to have a lot of things to say about Return to Oz. And if you want to be the first to know when I upload more videos about The Wizard of Oz or just Disney, Shakespeare, film, or cats, make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed already. If you haven't subscribed already, it is so easy. All you have to do is click on my face. Thanks for joining me again today, everyone. My name is Matt, and I have 2 degrees, and that's the Teacup For One. Go away.